Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 8 of the Green Agenda on the topic Unpacking Climate Anxiety, Tools for Finding Joy. My name is Kayla Shannon, your host, a recent alumna of Spelman College and an advocate for the city of Flint. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors, the Green Agenda, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the Climate Action Campaign. So today we'll be talking about the effects of climate change. The effects of climate change, like extreme weather events and environmental degradation, can significantly impact our mental health, causing increased anxiety, depression, and trauma. Tonight's episode will explore strategies for managing climate anxiety and finding joy amidst the challenges of the climate crisis. Our panelists will share personal experiences, research-backed techniques, and practical tips for cultivating hope, resilience, and moments of happiness in the face of environmental grief and uncertainty. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our hosts, McKenna and Wesley. Start with you, McKenna.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me on. My name is McKenna Dunbar, and first and foremost, I'm an environmental justice practitioner and a climate mental health advocate. I work full-time at Sierra Club, leading their building electrification and energy efficiency and initiatives and team in Virginia, though I work nationwide as well. I do rural organizing with communities on workforce development and the nexus of the clean energy transition in energy burden communities, while also tackling the Inflation Reduction Act rebates. In general, I'm very passionate about the intersections of energy burden, climate mental health, and more on the mortality aspect of what we're about to get into with eco-anxiety and grief.
Thank you, Wesley.
And my name is Wesley Wiggins. I am currently a PhD student at the University of Maryland, College Park, studying environmental health. I'm also the climate preparedness trainer for Young, Gifted, and Green. And those trainings I've been doing for about 2 years now. I just had one 2 weeks ago. Basically, those trainings were here in DC, also in the MLK library where we are now, helping residents of DC learn more about how to prepare for the impacts of climate change, and how to prepare. And that's the work that I also hope to be doing as I continue my PhD program, focusing on how to protect frontline communities from the impacts of climate change.
Thank you so much. So we have some experts here today, and excited to discuss this topic and hopefully glean some insights for you all. According to the American Public Health Association, climate change not only harms our physical health, it also threatens our mental wellness. Climate events such as extreme storms or extreme heat can lead to depression, anger, and even violence. Although we are all at risk, certain groups are more susceptible to distress and other mental health problems linked to climate change-related exposures. Children, seniors, women, particularly pregnant people and parents of newborns, people of color, people experiencing economic distress, people who are unhoused, people with pre-existing mental illness, and first responders are more vulnerable to negative mental health outcomes. Beginning with McKenna and then with Wesley, can you share your personal experiences with managing your mental health in the climate crisis and climate disasters?
Absolutely. I would say that my relationship with climate mental health has been a long and storied journey from since I can remember. I was fortunate enough to be introduced to the topic of climate change when I was younger, and learning about the disproportionate impacts that it has on communities that share my identities and look like me. And that was around primary school when I was 11 or 12. I was a part of an all-Black traveling robotics team that just focused on getting Black individuals and students into the STEM field like very early on. And that year we were competing in a first Lego League competition, FLL competition, and the theme of that competition that year for the project design was climate change. And so we had to build robotic structures to compete and do some simulations on this like large table with a bunch of like Lego looking pieces. And through the research of the small design team I was a part of in 5th grade, there were like 6-7 other people in middle school around my age. We decided that in the context of climate change, we wanted to focus on designing a product and invention that would be suitable for people of communities of color, essentially. And we decided to focus on a design that could have helped and supported communities of color in the events of Hurricane Katrina and specific natural disasters of that nature. As we know, the matter of vulnerability and the level of risk really determines how communities fare after large disasters and as a result of changing climate as a whole, especially Black communities. And what happened with many Black communities in Hurricane Katrina, they were devastated, their lands were devastated, and the impact of Hurricane Katrina was even greater because of where they were sited, where they lived, because of their skin color. And from that, we designed a floating toll booth and learned about resilience and the intersections of just climate mental health, which I didn't have the language for until recently, a few years ago. And that moment, it was, oh, people who looked like me were negatively impacted by this natural event because the politicians and structures in place did not choose to create more resilient infrastructure for people who had my backgrounds to live in. And that was the motivation of how I wanted to get more involved in just learning about infrastructure being built and designed in our country. Who does it favor? That's how I got into learning about redlining and how policies disenfranchise some people and promote the well-being of others for no reason other than the color of their skin. In terms of my journey in mental health, I would say that I've always felt a sense of grief about the state of our world, and to define grief, or at least what grief means to me. And I used to work in the funeral industry for 4 years. I was a mortician's assistant. I view grief as the confluence of two emotions. So grief for me can be, I'm hopeful and I'm devastated. I'm anxious and I'm angry. I'm happy and I'm perturbed. It could be any two emotions, but that sense of grief about the changing structures of our world wasn't rooted just because the weather patterns were changing. It was more in the realization that climate change, as we know, is not just an issue of, time. It's also an issue of scale. Yes, it's normal for the weather patterns to change and the world to change. That's how society works. That's how humanity has worked for a long time. But it's the level to how we're using fossil fuels. And the reason that I decided to pursue a career in convoluted topics like energy efficiency and electrification is because I personally experienced energy burden as a child. I was part of a single family household, single mother household, and with that grief already of knowing that communities of color and people who looked like me were already disproportionately impacted because of our skin and because of the types of geographies that we lived in, while also knowing that there are other social inequities that are layered on top of issues of environmental injustice, or what I came to find out is environmental justice. It just made me more upset and angry in many ways, and that has fueled my resolve to try to change the tide, at least in the energy burden section of promoting weatherization and energy efficient technologies, so we can focus on occupant comfort and health, especially since we know that there are no indoor air quality standards. And we'll talk much more about it, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I think there's so much in a story, right? There's so much in each of our individual stories as far as what brings us to the work and what brings us into the movement, and especially having a personal connection and having many personal experiences that draw you into beyond the statistics of it all, right? I've spoken before about the ways in which an anecdotal story can often do a much better job of explaining the impact of many of these social and environmental issues beyond just like, here are the data and statistic that speak to improve these phenomena that are occurring. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your story, and I look forward to talking more. Wesley.
Yeah, I'd say I first learned about climate change. I think it wasn't really until about 10th grade, which I feel was a bit late. But I was you were in robotics. I was in debate on a debate team. Our kind of topic for that month of competition was climate change, and that was kind of my crash course and how I got really involved. And as I transitioned to college, that really became a lot of the driving force. And in college is when I started really learning about environmental justice. But I hadn't really gotten to that point where I tied the two together. And then, which I think is an event that is kind of the precipice, or like the real inciting event that got a lot of the nation talking more about mental health, was COVID. And I think for me, COVID was definitely the event, or I say was, like it isn't still affecting us. But I feel like COVID really, especially in those first couple of years, a lot happened to just shift my perspective. And I bring it up because when I'm thinking about climate change, I'm thinking about environmental justice. That's kind of when I put those two together, so that when I was, through undergrad, I was like, it's all about the science, all about the science. Like, no, it's about the whole story, like you were saying. And thinking about that lived experience of people, which is kind of why now I do environmental health. The other reason that I got into where I am now with health is because COVID took a lot out of me personally. And in those first 2 years of 2020 and 2021, I lost so much. I was studying abroad when the pandemic hit. That sucked because that was a lot of time and energy that had just been ripped away. I lost my entire senior year. And we were on campus since the spring, but it was nothing was the same. I lost my grandmother, and that was a devastating loss for my whole family. So much had changed, and by the time that I was coming out of undergrad, I was lower than I had anticipated, just from a mental health standpoint. To the point I was severely depressed by the time we get to January, February, March of 2022. And I'm thankful to my parents who were sat me down and was we're worried about you. And I don't think if it were for them, I wouldn't have, got to seek help as I did. But I think what was so, that year started off terribly, but by the end of that year, everything had changed. And I think a part of being in the climate space is, I think of it like you're hitting your head against a brick wall, it feels like sometimes, because you see all this happening, especially when we're talking about environmental justice. Is when you add that in, it gets even worse, because you see all that needs to be done, or all that you want to get done, I should say, and you see roadblock after roadblock after roadblock, things that are just completely out of your control. And as I was, growing up, a lot of the sentiments that I got from professors and teachers was hey, it's your problem now. We're going to pass the buck on to you guys, which is really not fair when A, you're not really equipping us to deal with this, and B, you're not even letting us do the stuff that you need us to do because you're still in those positions of power and not letting them go. And so when you're being in the climate space, it's so taxing on your own mental health. But I think that the biggest thing for me at that top of that year is that I felt like I had no future left. And there was no way to move forward. And I think the biggest lesson I had to learn that year was that there is a future. It's not going to look like the way it does now. There's a quote that I really love. It's it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It's easier to imagine the world ending versus the world just changing. And I think that shift of, what does the world look like if we solve all this? I think that's the question I had to ask myself, and that's how I got out of this. And I think a part of how I got out of it was, one, imagining a better future. There's this really great genre of art and literature that I found called solar punk, which, if you've heard of cyberpunk, it's like that, or cyberpunk is like dystopian future, ads everywhere, dark gray skies, corporations rule everything. And solar punk is kind of the opposite of that, where it's like, hey, we did it. We figured out climate change and the world is more peaceful now. It's greener now. It's healthier now. And I think immersing myself in that and immersing myself in topics like climate resilience were really helpful for saying our future isn't as bleak as I think it could be. And even though, things are sucky most of the time now, it feels like, they're like, just reigniting that hope within myself was how I had to move forward.
Thank you, Wesley. There are so many great things. I feel like you all set a great foundation for this discussion today, and I'm really excited to delve further into it. But one thing that really stuck out to me that you said, Wesley, was considering the intersectionality of confronting solutions in a social justice space while also wrestling against the emotions that you face as a warrior and an advocate in this space, right? Because it's so easy to be oriented toward, and I think we're taught even in a radical space, right? Like, as people who are advocating against the system, we're taught first about the advocacy, right? We're taught about the fight. We're taught about the issue. We're taught about the problem. We're even taught about the solution without being prepared for the burden of what it is to carry justice work, right? That it's not just fighting against or for environmental health. It's not just, or any other issue. It's not just fighting against sexism or racism or homophobia or all of these intersecting systems. It's also being prepared for the grief that you're to face along the way, right? It's being prepared for the obstacle, and it's being prepared to come up against that obstacle repeatedly and having the strength and the hope to overcome and continuing to face that. So I really appreciate both of your perspectives and the stage that it sets for further discussion. According to Rutgers University, early research has established a strong association between warm weather and violent crime that typically peaks in the summer. 2023 marked the hottest year in modern history with 18,456 homicides reported in the U.S. According to Axios, the FBI reported that the certain cities saw a rise in homicides in 2023. Including Washington, D.C., which increased by 36%, Memphis, which increased by 31%, and Dallas, which increased by 14%. This time beginning with Wesley and then to McKenna, how might the predicted increase in extreme heat events due to climate change impact rates of violent crime and public safety in communities? That's the first question. And then as a follow-up, what strategies can urban planners, law enforcement, and community organizations implement to mitigate these potential risks and protect vulnerable populations?
Yeah, I think, and you mentioned the DC statistic. I know in terms of strategies, or let me back up and say extreme heat and disasters in general are or definitely have a substantial effect on mental health, which I think also substantially affects crime as well. And I can't really speak too well to the exact connection because it's difficult to say hotter temperatures definitely equal crime because statistics don't really work too well that way with more qualitative impacts. But I'd say I think a lot about with DC being from here, hearing how DC has responded to crime and how I would like them to respond to crime, especially in the face of climate change, which you have the Secure DC Crime Omnibus package that passed earlier this year, which is pretty controversial and not well loved by the community because a lot of the strategies that they tended to use were like trying to just stop the problem from happening, just like, hey, we're just going to put like a drug-free zone in this community and this will stop the problem. But it just, stops it from happening maybe in a certain location, but the things that caused that problem are still happening and aren't being addressed by government. So I think like one of the strategies is addressing kind of the key indicators, motivators of crime, which is poverty is one of the biggest. And I think, when you're talking about climate change as well, the people that are impoverished are some of the most vulnerable to climate change impacts as well, because they don't have the resources. Thinking about DC, the neighborhood I'm from in Ward 8, we're a food desert. And the one grocery store we have is also like under threat of closing down because it's kind of robbed a lot. There's a lot of theft in that grocery store. But you have if we don't have a grocery store in our community, if we're trying to prepare for like a flood, where do we go to get food? And if you remember during COVID, you had all those stories of like, there's no more toilet paper. The toilet paper is gone. If something like that happens at this giant, there's very few other places for people in that community to go. Not to mention the gentrification happening in those communities already further pushing them out, robbing people of resources. So I think, the strategies that we need to undertake are the ones that address the vulnerabilities that are at the center of all this, or like the cause, the motivator of crime, the sensitivity, increased sensitivity to climate impacts. So I think that's the big thing in terms of like, how do we address this effectively? In terms of the heat in and of itself, I think some of the biggest things to address heat when we have those extreme heat events, DC has cooling centers, and I think those are incredibly important, especially for kind of talking about the intersections of climate change and poverty again. There's like housing that doesn't have air conditioning, and those people, and not to mention unhoused people that need a place to go in times of extreme heat. But I think one of the problems that DC has, and part of the reasons why I do the training, is because not enough people know that these resources do already exist. And I think that DC could do a lot more to address heat. Like, for example, with their urban heat island effect, cities are warmer because there's just more concrete that absorbs more heat. And you have this, you kind of look at all these, impacts cumulatively. And so there's more that we can do to address that specific problem, but like even just making sure people are more aware of the resources that already exist are going to help us right now. So that's my answer.
That's so good. I think one of the first things that came to my mind as you were talking about the quantitative or correlative relationship that has yet to be distinctly proven as far as causation goes. It's just that, like, I don't know, I'm more angry when I'm hot. I don't know, it's funny and it's commonsensical, but like even in simple ways, right? We can understand how, as people, when our basic needs are not met, right? Like what happens when we're not maintaining homeostasis, like the chemical and hormonal things that are off, right? When you're just not maintaining your basic physical needs, right? But also, in addition to that, jokingly, it's considering the prevention and preparedness tactics that need to be in place, right? In considering and recognizing the risk that we have, right? The risk that we're facing on an ongoing basis, especially for our vulnerable communities that already struggle at a baseline with having these discussions about mental health, right? With having these conversations in communities that sometimes resort to violence as a means of, like, I don't have any other way that I've been taught to deal with my emotions or to deal with my frustrations or or any avenues that have been presented to me in order to process through my struggles. And even just talking about the fact that, and recognizing that these communities are so often consistently facing obstacles and barriers and burdens without having an opportunity to pause, right? Even as a nation, right, we haven't had much time to process through the COVID-19 pandemic. We haven't had much time as a people to process through the ongoing instances of police brutality that are occurring on a regular basis and that we're facing across social media. We don't have time then also to really deal with and process the climate events that are occurring on a regular basis across the country, like not even just concentrated in certain areas, all the way from Michigan to Texas. People are facing unprecedented climate events that they've never experienced before. And with that, with all of that being said, it's so important for us to have resources that are driven by that need, right? But not only to have them, but to have ways in which people recognize that they exist, because that's also across communities a consistent issue that people are facing, that all of these resources exist, but nobody's accessing them because many people don't know about them, right? So how can we work proactively, not just to solve or remedy the symptoms of these problems, which can be violence, as an example, but to think deeply about how we can proactively prepare for the things that we know are likely to result from these changing times. McKenna, do you have something you'd like to offer?
Yes, I have a few things. I first wanted to appreciate the framing of your question to not only address the impact of heat on violent crimes, but also on public safety. And I work directly with a wraparound service provider, and her name is Shelly. She works in partnership with an organization called Flip Inc., which is a workforce NABCEP accredited program, North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners, who prioritizes accredited solar installation training for divested individuals, namely formerly incarcerated individuals and presently incarcerated individuals. I support them in regional jail work. The reason I mention this is because Shelly is a social worker and is a part of the National American Social Work Union or organization, NASW. NASW, one of their main social justice priorities is environmental justice. And under some of their resources, and I found this a few weeks ago because of Shelly's suggestion, and because I have already had leadership positions in the climate mental health sphere, and I knew about this statistic but didn't know the exact numbers and the studies behind it. Essentially, the statistic I'm about to share is that increased heat in extreme heat events increases rates of suicide in the United States and in Mexico. And I've heard about how increased heat through anthropological interviews I've had the opportunity to host through grants a few years ago in the community of Portsmouth, Virginia, which is located in Hampton Roads, Virginia, which is the largest group of African Americans in the entire country, based on where Black individuals live. And essentially this statistic is that for every monthly, like 1 degree Celsius increase, like every month, the rate of suicide increases 0.7% in the United States and 1.2% in Mexico. They estimated that between 9 and 40,000 suicide deaths will take place by 2050 with unchecked climate change. And that's just for the United States and Mexico, and that is with a 95% positivity rate. So numbers don't lie, but the reason I mention that is because the second part of your question addresses the strategies that urban planners, law enforcement, and community organizations as a whole can prioritize in order to increase resilience. And being that I work in the building industry and do a lot of organizing with communities on energy burden, I appreciated your inclusion of cooling centers, because while cities like Washington, D.C. have cooling centers, cities like Richmond only have one. And that is something I even just brought up a few days ago to the Office of Sustainability, who is doing amazing work as it relates to energy efficiency and shifting the city to a more promising future. But that is a problem. One small cooling center in a fairly inaccessible area of the city for hundreds and thousands of residents is an inherent problem. So strategies for urban planners: increase the percentage of tree canopy in divested neighborhoods. Like you said, systemic injustices layer on top of environmental injustice and the impacts of extreme heat. More collaborations and funding for the remedying of food deserts, like in communities. I live in Jackson Ward, which is a historically Black community, and Monroe Ward and South Side are historically or historic neighborhoods that have not received enough attention in the overarching social justice conversation. I would also say for urban planners, making communities aware, especially communities, and I'm going to speak an example of Southside Richmond, when thinking about the siting of resilience hubs or community hubs, think about the impact of like stormwater management or wastewater management if there aren't like energy hubs near the communities, in terms of like if a natural disaster occurs and all the electricity powers off, the communities that are furthest from the main hubs that they turn on first, especially those near hospitals and other important sites, you have to ensure that the energy burdened communities are made aware that they are facing disproportionate lead times in getting the lights back on. And this happens plenty, and I'm not talking about Richmond right now, but this happens plenty with Indigenous communities. They're typically the furthest away from at the end of the line when the lights come back on. Thinking about like cooling centers, expanding those, as I mentioned earlier, bringing back up the social worker conversation, which I will talk about later. I think it's important that in these cooling centers, there be mental health professionals and trained individuals like yourself communicating the impact of the weather on externalities other than, feeling physically hot, and how that can impact and exacerbate asthma or bronchitis or indoor air pollution harms in general. So I do think overall that, and one other thing too, I've heard in a few circles that, and I do not think that, as my personal opinion, I don't think that we should be increasing police presence in BIPOC communities and Black communities specifically, because I'm Afro-Latinx myself in general. And there are ideas and methodologies floating around related to extreme heat events and law enforcement by way of heat-sensitive policies. I would recommend individuals Google that if you don't know what that means. Essentially, it's in times of the day where it is hotter, you deploy more police officers because there will be more crime. And I don't think that should be our first solution in attacking the extreme heat event conversation. I'm envisioning more inclusion of social workers and community interventions and strategies of, evaluating the risk levels and taking a more human-centered approach than considering locking people up first, and when situations like this occur.
Yeah. I think something important to note there as we discuss law enforcement and their intervention. I think it's always something important to note when we're discussing law enforcement in interventions, especially in BIPOC communities, the fraught relationship that BIPOC communities have with law enforcement, and the patterns that we have seen with law enforcement not being the source of de-escalation, that in situations oftentimes or regularly at the very least, we see them causing more strife and stress and concern and worry and anxiety that many times can cause a situation to escalate further, right? And so I think it's important for us to note and consider seriously, as you said, other interventions and other ways that community members and social workers and other just people forward facing institutions and employees can support in, again, the prevention and preparedness of these issues. I mean, we could, I'm sure, talk for much longer about what that training and preparedness could look like for law enforcement, as that is the role that they're meant to serve in. But as it stands right now, I think it's incredibly important for us to consider other alternatives to just sending more officers out. So since we're on the subject of solutions, beginning with McKenna and then Wesley, what concrete action should our elected officials and government agencies at the federal, state, and local levels take to address the growing mental health impacts of climate change in our communities? And specifically, if you could speak to how you think government agencies can ensure equitable access to climate-related mental health support for marginalized populations.
Thank you for asking that. I will address these questions and then pivot slightly back to add a previous answer to the other question because it's relevant. I will tackle the latter question first regarding how can government ensure more equitable access to these climate mental health strategies for divested populations. I would say, first and foremost, I do not believe that policy will be the transformative change that we need to address systemic inequities. I don't believe that. I think that people-forward approaches are and community-centered work will develop that change, but I do see in a very important role, a tool in the toolbox, if you will, for this transformation using policies and federal investments that we have under the Inflation Reduction Act to really push this conversation on climate mental health. I would say first and foremost, under the GGRF, which is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, there are two pots of funding. There's a community-centered one and an investment-centered one that the EPA has deployed. One of them is called the Community Climate Change Grants, and these are grants in between $10 and $20 million for localities to essentially push for solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there are a multitude of ways that different localities have actually submitted their ideas, and these are on a rolling basis until November. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because in these strategies that localities and organizations have partnered together for, they are focused on climate-centered work in the workforce sphere and building decarbonization, which is the process of shifting away from fossil fuels in the built environment in the residential, commercial, industrial context. I specifically find an opportunity for climate mental health support through the creation of small community grants, a part of what the locality is submitting for $20 million, to have allocated grants in divested communities in those localities to be able to partner with social workers, to be able to partner with housing justice organizations, to partner with YIMBY organizations, yes, in my backyard organizations, to partner with organizations working at the nexus of food insecurities and of criminal justice systems, to leverage networks in these different areas to promote conversations on climate mental health, the intersections of whatever their main focus is on the intersections of climate mental health. And because climate touches each and every aspect of our lives, it's quite easy to make that correlation and the justification for having programs of that nature and having grants be available in that nature. Those grants could, for example, go towards establishing a climate mental health clinic at a cooling center in DC and a partnership with young gifted and green. And it could also be allocated for funds for social workers in, for example, a university like Virginia Commonwealth University, to create a hub in Jackson Ward and partner with the neighborhood association to have these conversations. Or I'm working with an organization now called Virginia Community Voice, where they're developing a well-being center specifically for Black and Hispanic women, where they're ideating programming for climate mental health to be included in their overarching initiative. I think that in general, more concrete solutions for elected officials would be the first putting into bill language the importance of climate mental health as it relates to climate refugees, because that is a growing topic, especially in states like Texas and California, where we see horrible natural disasters happening and many individuals, hundreds, thousands of individuals having to abandon the life that they have been accustomed to because their home burned down or in a fire, because their home was torn up in a tornado and they do not have anywhere else to go. I think we need to focus more on, like as a society, but more specifically as officials, how to mitigate the stressors and, as you mentioned earlier, the burdens that individuals are experiencing who face climate mental health struggles because of a loss of infrastructure and because of a loss of resources from natural disasters. I think when we're thinking about local level action, partnering with your city or locality's resilience officer or Office of Sustainability to host and collaborate with organizations, especially BIPOC organizations, who have already been doing the work. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think that one of the core aspects of environmental justice is that the movement, whatever movement, should be led by the people directly being impacted by the disaster, by the environmental harm. And in this case, those who have experience working with individuals who come from divested backgrounds, leaders who are a part of those communities already, and individuals who have trauma-informed training for mental health professions. That should be something that is prioritized, and more advocacy focused. I think that there needs to be a more thorough conversation on the role that psychiatrists and mental health professionals who, don't know much about climate and don't include it in their practice, to be able to support them with education programming and incentives to start developing these conversations within their circles and associations. There's plenty of climate, for example, Climate Mental Health Network has amazing resources. There's Climate Psychiatry Alliance and a number of resources online that's already available. But I think that we need to do a better job bridging that gap.
Yeah. Something that really stuck out to me while you were speaking was the aspect of grant making specifically for grassroots organizations. I think so often, and the point that you made as far as policy not being the end all be all. I think policy is a great it's a great starting point. It's a great tool, right? But it's also oftentimes the breakdown is in the implementation of policy. So it's great to have something written on paper somewhere, right? But then also, when we saw this with the the ARPA funds and locally in the city of Flint, where it was so great when ARPA dollars were passed, right? There were all of these promises at the local level about what it meant, at the state and local level about what it meant for ARPA dollars to be coming into our community, and what great opportunity it would create for local organizations, and how they hope to see changes come from them. And in many extents, there are still people waiting on ARPA dollars, right? And also, once the funds were allocated, they weren't allocated in a way that was transparent to community about what the process was, right? In addition, there were many organizations that consistently receive funds that are much larger, have much larger budgets, and once again received those funds, and it wasn't disseminated to grassroots organizations doing more of the footwork on the ground, or small grassroots organizations that are, looking to grow. And so I think it's so important for us to be in consideration. This is not a dissuasion in any way from people voting and participating in the political process. Please do so, because policy is important, but it's also the accountability that occurs after policy, right? And it's also us at the community level being able and prepared to do the work beyond policy, right, to ensure that people have the resources necessary in order to actually implement, the work that we're talking about, right? Again, it's a beautiful thing to see it on paper, but it's another thing to see it in action. And those are two very different conversations, and two very different tools that need to operate together in order for us to see lasting change.
Exactly. And on that point, I hear a lot of, and this is more in the conference space for the energy industry, I hear a lot of, oh, we need to provide a seat at the table for environmental justice communities when we have these conversations about revitalization and development. I do not participate in ideologies like that. I truly do believe that environmental justice communities are the table. They shouldn't just have a seat. They are the entire table. And I think we need to decolonize our thinking and our traditional ways of doing business as usual, the business as usual approach that is very typical in the industries like mine that have to implement the policies and have to create the policies and attempt to communicate with, environmental justice communities. There needs to be a revitalization in that aspect. Apologies for the interruption.
No, please. Because I think you're speaking to something that's so true, and it's a tale as old as time, right? That it's, as Wesley was saying, so much easier to imagine that like the world is coming to an end than it is to imagine capitalism coming to an end. And in the same way, for us to imagine that these are conversations that we can change, right? That we are able as a people to alter the framework of our systems of operation, of our traditions, of our norms. But I think then the struggle becomes the work again of facing the burden and the grief of it being an ongoing and almost seemingly everlasting process, right? That in order to overcome a system that is as old as our country is, right? That really predates the establishment of our country, right? How do we work together to come up against these things, and to again radically alter, because it is going to take radical alterations and changes and adjustments to not only our systems and frameworks, but the ways in which they have been embedded in our society, and our ways of socialization and our ways of thinking. Because even myself, and I mean, I consider myself fairly radical and forward thinking, there's also ways of thinking that are easy for me to sink into, as far as like, okay, but like racism will always be a thing, right? These are always things that we're going to face, and that's just like a fact of our reality, right? And so I think it's very important to have those conversations about, not just a seat at the table, but we are the table, and how can we make that the standard of the discussions that we're having, instead of continuing to fight for to hear me, like what happens. What happens when you don't, right? What's our next step? Wesley.
A lot of what you've been thinking about is maybe thinking about the project that I'm working on right now with my PhD advisor about migrant and seasonal farm workers in the eastern shore of Maryland. And I think one of the, like, in terms of like, how can we rely on the government? I think the thing that's really telling is that, and a lot of these farm workers are housed by the farm owners, but repeatedly we see in migrant labor camps throughout, the Eastern Shore, that they are poor quality housing. They can't stand up to the extreme heat that they face. There's an example, like, they don't have running water, they don't have like a plumbing system, and these houses are supposed to go through an inspection every 3 years because of the labor protections that are in law. And a part of that is that, like, these inspections are supposed to happen by a certain entity, and we cannot figure out who that entity is. And it's been very difficult to like track down, here is the entity on the eastern shore of Maryland that is responsible for inspections of these housing. We cannot find these people. It's not clear in the legislation, it's not clear in anywhere. And it just speaks to that idea of like, there are so many people not being protected, that desperately need protection but are almost invisible. And I think, seasonal farm workers are some of those people. And I think, that's one example, but you see this all over, of just like, there's the gap in the implementation, and the policy and the implementation is there. And I think that's where, that's a part of it, not where all of it, but a good part of like how vulnerabilities are created is where that happens. And I think, going back to the broader question, I think in terms of concrete actions that our government should take, it's tricky to answer, I would say, because there's like a whole list of things that I think they do, but in terms of how
manifesto.
There's a whole list, and it's like how even like, I have this whole list, and I look at the state of the federal government at the very least, and just being like, there's so much that needs to change, but like the system is not built to change. And like what we need to see is transformation in the way giving the government back to the people, because there's so many mechanisms set up in the government where the people don't have a say where they should. And I think, and thinking like when it comes to mental health, my answer would be like, well, expansive access to healthcare and like medical, like our mental health services. And it's like, well, people can't afford those services because they don't have, like, there's no universal healthcare. So you have this list of things, and like, the big thing above all, to help tackle climate mental health, you want to solve climate change. That'll do it. That'll relieve a lot of it. So in terms of like concrete actions, it's difficult to like pinpoint just the one that'll be like, there's no like one size fits all solution. It's like a whole system. The whole system has to change. I think if like, and kind of on a lower level, kind of thinking like maybe more local level, I think governments need to do a better job of just sharing what already exists, and not just sharing as in like we need to talk to more people about it, but in terms of how we implement change, where the areas where like city governments get the most feedback at like town halls or like events like that are inaccessible to most people. So like the avenues where we can actually, and I think like for mental health, one of the best ways to like go like to use those emotions is like to put them into action and to actually advocate for change. But like those avenues for change are so like not available to people that it's so difficult to like, here's how we can do it, and it's like, I have to work, or I have this or that going on, and it's difficult to attend. And I think that's the tricky thing about getting governments to change, is that they need to make sure, and talking about make sure that their events, the levers that the government has for change are equitable, are accessible to all people. So I think that's a big thing that could change.
Thank you.
I appreciate that you brought up the meeting spaces and the places of convening for local leadership, particularly with city council, because those are excellent forums. What I learned earlier this year, due to me attending a zoning meeting in Chesterfield County, which is actually the fastest growing county in Virginia, they host their community room in the right wing of the Chesterfield police station. So that brings up the intersection. Oh,
yeah,
an immense barrier.
Yeah.
I thought I was, and I had the address correct. I thought I was in the wrong location, and I looped around, and then I parked in the parking lot of the police station, and I was hesitant to enter, and I, in that moment, would have felt horrible if, and because it was my first time there, sending this address to communities that I work with to meet me here for this convening on zoning priorities and me learning more about the zoning priorities in Chesterfield because of my job, to find out that it was in a police station. And as we talked about earlier, communities of color and Black communities specifically have a very different relationship with law enforcement than other individuals do. So that it can be a concrete action as well, making more accessible, equitable spaces to convene and to promote these dialogues for change. So thank you for bringing that up.
That's so good. Oh, there's so much more that I'd love to talk about, but unfortunately we are coming to the end of another powerful conversation on the Green Agenda, and we do like to end with words of power and a call to action. I think as we were rounding off, what really sunk or was impressed upon my heart is the general, we started by talking about grief, right? And we started by talking about the introductions that you all had, and I think there is such a burden in the fight for justice across the board, right? But most especially today in discussing environmental justice in a space where the things that we're coming up against, the forces and powers that be, so to speak, right, are so have so much power, right? Have financial power, have inherent power systemically, there's all of these things, and it's created such a sense of disillusionment amongst even advocates, but especially in communities that are historically disadvantaged and that continue to face disproportionate burdens of these issues. And I think what was impressed upon my heart is just the deep need in our communities for opportunities for hope and joy. Like, that is such a seemingly simple and like okay, we just need to be happy, but beyond not just happiness, but opportunities for us to truly medicinally, spiritually connect to wells and opportunities of joy in our community. And I just think that it's so important for each and every one of us to find opportunities to choose our joy, to seek our joy, to fight for like joy as a radical act of perseverance and of justice. Like that is as much a part of the fight for justice as the advocacy rally or these conversations is finding opportunities for us to sink into that. And so for each of you, in about a minute or less, what final words do you have of power or call to action do you have for our audience?
I'm going to try to first. I had a lot of notes I wrote, and I was like, okay, how do I boil it all down? I think, I'll go on a list. I think one thing is, I wanted to talk a bit more about this with social media. First of all, is how a lot of us get our news these days. But realizing, I think one thing I had to realize is that like social media is built to keep you on there. And how do they do that? They incite fear and anger in you. And I think that is a real part of eco-anxiety. So I think just a quick tip: curate your online experience. You have they're hidden, but there are a lot of tools to like help you make sure that you're not like getting things in your face all the time that's like scared, making sure we curate some joy and like are able to take a break every once in a while. Never like, I wouldn't say like completely detached because it's like important information on social media, but make sure you're not overwhelming yourself with information. I think is something that's helped me kind of stay present. I think the second thing is live within your values. I think there's a lot of values I think are impressed upon us that maybe not like don't fit with us. And I think when you live with your values, it's easier to find your space within the climate movement. I'll say when I was, back when I started therapy, I think that was an activity that my therapist ran through with me. And I think finding my values helped me identify climate resilience. Like, this is the space I want to be in because I value protection of people and my family and my community and the world. And that last part, I think one last tip is don't think you can take on the whole world. And I think is another trap that I fell into, in that like feeling like I had to do everything and like it was all on my shoulders. And I think that was not fair to myself because I can't like, I can't even begin to save the whole world. But like, I think recognizing you can change, you might not be able to save the whole world, but you can save somebody. You can help somebody, and like taking little steps, you can affect people around you, I think is one. But also two, and I think, community is a huge deal in that when you find community, you find other people that are doing this work. I mean, I remember when I like got in touch with you on Gifted and Green, I remember like a month before I got the call for like the EJ Griot program, I was like, I really want to do a climate training. And someone was like, you really need to find a nonprofit to work with. And I was like, that's a good point. I was trying to think about how I could do it myself. Then I got in touch with you on Gifted and Green, took the EJ Griot program, and had the opportunity to start doing some climate resilience work. And I was like, yes, this is what I needed. I needed community, I needed connection. And it's also why I'm here at this specific event too. So, so yeah, those are my three things.
Thanks, Wesley. McKenna, wrap us up.
Yes, to keep it short, my favorite quote since I was young is a German quote, actually. It's Anfangen ist leicht, Beharren eine Kunst. That means starting is easy, but persistence is an art. And this has followed me throughout my entire life and really resonates with me because of this conversation about resilience, about climate mental health, because starting the journey of understanding your triggers and motivations in your climate journey is critical to understand the tools and resources you need to face it with your community and lean into vulnerability and become a more equipped individual for not only yourself, but for the people around you. And I find it really important that you brought up the concept of joy, and specifically Black joy, because joy is not randomly stumbled upon. It has to be created, especially under the confines of capitalism and segregation that all of us live in, no matter the color of our skin. So to that, I say, be yourself, be your biggest advocate. And for me personally, I embrace a number of tenets of Stoicism, and I tend to really reflect on I can only change the things that are within my control, and I have to be okay with that in that moment, because I want my attention to be here, I want my focus to be here, and I want to find meaning in the work that I do.
Very good. Well, thank you both so much for offering your valuable insight on this subject. I hope you all gained so much from this discussion as much as I did. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of The Green Agenda. We look forward to seeing you back here next month. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.